Hello pretty peoples, Kawajapa no Kyodori desu. Today we're going to discuss ichidan versus godan verbs. Some people call them u-verbs and ru-verbs, and that's really quite ridiculous because all verbs end in the u sound, only a minority end in the actual u kana. All ichidan verbs end with ru, but then so do a number of godan verbs, and that's the very problem we're here to discuss. If my voice sounds a little strange, I apologize. I have contracted a slight digital virus which is affecting my throat circuits. I should be better by next time. Now, I'm always telling you that there are very few things in Japanese grammar that you need to learn on a case-by-case basis, the way the textbooks tend to teach it. You just need to learn the underlying logic, and then you have whole chunks of Japanese grammar easily assimilable. That's what I'm here to do. However, the case of ichidan verbs versus ru-ending godan verbs is one of the few areas where you really do have to learn things on a case-by-case basis. But wait, don't start getting out any lists of verbs to learn. That's not the way to do it. You don't need to do it, and it's a complete waste of your time if you do it. Why? Let me explain. The first thing I'll say, just in case your textbook didn't tell you, and they don't always, the only ambiguous ru-ending verbs are those that end with the sound iru or eru, because ichidan verbs can only end iru or eru. That is to say, before the ru, there must be a kana from the i-ro, or a kana from the e-ro. If not, then it's a godan verb. No ambiguity about it. But of the rest, the iru and eru ending verbs, the majority are ichidan. But there is a significant number of commonly used iru, eru ending godan verbs, and that's the problem. So how do we solve that problem? And why am I telling you not to learn lists? Well, to begin with, let's look rationally at when you actually need to know this. If you're reading something in a book, or hearing it, or watching anime with subtitles, or in any other way passively inputting the word, you don't need to know whether that word is ichidan or godan. In other words, as long as it's part of your passive vocabulary, you don't need that information. It's given to you on a need-to-know basis by the text itself. When do you actually need to know it? When you start outputting it. Now, everyone who is learning language organically, from small children onward, learns the word first as part of their passive vocabulary, and over time it moves into their active vocabulary. That's how children learn language. They hear it a lot of times, and then they start trying to use it. So we need to know whether a word is ichidan or godan when it is part of our active vocabulary. And the truth is that by the time it's part of our active vocabulary, by the time it's no longer just a word we hear sometimes, but a word we can actually use, we know the word. It is a friend. And we will know whether it's ichidan or godan. Not because we've memorized a rule or a fact, but because we will be familiar with at least one instance of the word which tells us whether it's ichidan or godan. As a matter of fact, even before you started learning Japanese, you knew such instances. You just didn't know at that stage how to apply them. Let me give you an example. You know the word kimono, don't you? Kimono is made up of two words, kiru, wear, and mono, thing. Kimono is a wear thing, a traditional article of Japanese clothing. Now, if you know the word kimono, you also know that kiru, wear, is an ichidan verb. How do you know that? Because the word is kimono and not kirimono. If it were a godan verb, it would have to be kirimono. If it's kimono, it must be an ichidan verb. If you don't know why that is, then watch my video on the subject. But also, if you don't know why that is, you certainly don't need to know which verbs are ichidan and which verbs are godan at this stage. Now, there are many other instances of this. For example, if you know that aruite imasu is the formal version of aruite iru, they both mean be walking. Iru means be. Aruite is the te form of walk. If you know aruite imasu or anything else imasu, then you know that iru is an ichidan verb. Why? Because it's imas and not irimas. So you see that by the time you get to the stage of needing to know, you will know. Not necessarily in the abstract, but you will have instances that you can quickly reverse engineer to tell you whether any given word out of the small proportion of words that are ambiguous is ichidan or godan. So why do people think they have to learn this from lists? I think it's because textbooks are built around exams, and even books that aren't textbooks tend to get their Japanese structure taken from textbooks, and they were all built around exams. And exams sometimes ask you to know things out of context. But if you're learning Japanese organically, you don't need to know anything out of context. What if you do? What if you're going in for an exam, or for some other reason you need to know whether a word is ichidan or godan out of context? Well, don't try to memorize whether the word is ichidan or godan. Instead of that, memorize an instance, because that way you kill two birds with one stone, you learn another word, and you're using Japanese more organically. Instead of referring to some list when you want to use it, you're referring to a piece of living Japanese that you know. So, for example, if you want to know whether deru, come out, is ichidan or godan, learn the word deguchi, which means an exit. You'll see it all over Japan on doors. Deguchi, exit. Once you know that this word is deguchi and not deriguchi, you know that deru is ichidan and not godan. So, throw away all those lists of ichidan and godan verbs. Remember that most verbs are not ambiguous, and the few that are, either wait until you know it organically and naturally, or if you have to learn it, learn an instance, not a rule. Please remember that the course book for this course of lessons is Unlocking Japanese. You can get it at Amazon in paperback or Kindle editions. If you have any comments or questions, please ask them in the comments below and I will answer. Thank you for attending this lesson. Kore kara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.